économique se redresse. Troisièmement, la possibilité d'un conflit commercial déclenché par de nouveaux droits de douane américains est une source majeure d'incertitude. Cela pourrait beaucoup perturber l'économie canadienne et brouille actuellement les perspectives.
Taux directeur de 25 points de base. Cette sixième baisse consécutive fait passer le taux à 3 %. On a aussi annoncé notre plan pour finir de normaliser notre bilan, en mettre fin au resserrement quantitatif. La Banque va recommencer à acheter des actifs au début de mars. Les achats seront graduels au départ pour que son bilan se stabilise cette année et croisse ensuite modestement au rythme de la croissance de l'économie. On a trois grands messages ce matin. Premièrement, l'inflation est près de la cible de 2 % depuis l'été dernier. La politique monétaire a permis de rétablir la stabilité des prix. Deuxièmement, les taux d'intérêt plus bas stimulent les dépenses des ménages et l'activité économique se redresse. Mais, troisièmement, la possibilité d'un conflit commercial déclenché par de nouveaux droits de douane américains est une source majeure d'incertitude. Ça pourrait beaucoup perturber l'économie canadienne et brouiller les perspectives. Since the scope and duration of a possible trade conflict are impossible to predict, the NPR projection we published today provides a baseline forecast in the absence of tariffs. We also provide some discussion of the potential consequences of a major trade conflict. Let me expand on the first two messages before turning to the threat of tariffs. First, inflation. A year ago, inflation was 3%. Short-term expectations were still elevated, and inflationary pressures were broader than normal. In recent months, inflation has remained close to 2%. Business and consumer expectations have largely normalized, and there is no longer evidence of broad-based inflationary pressures. Shelter price inflation remains elevated, but is gradually coming down. While we expect some volatility in CPI inflation due to temporary tax measures, our forecast is that inflation will remain close to the 2% target over the next 2 years. Second, growth. There are signs economic activity is gaining momentum as past interest rate cuts work their way through the economy. Lower borrowing costs are boosting activity in the housing market, as well as spending on big-ticket items like automobiles. The pickup in household spending is starting to broaden to other consumer items and is projected to strengthen further. Business investment has been weak, but is forecast to increase gradually. And the outlook for exports is being supported by new export capacity for oil and gas. Employment has strengthened in recent months, but with job creation having lagged labor force growth for more than a year, the labor market remains soft. The unemployment rate was 6.7% in December, and wage pressures, which have proven sticky, are showing some signs of easing. The bank forecasts GDP growth will strengthen from 1.3% in 2024 to 1.8% in 2025 and 2026. Growth in GDP per person is projected to pick up as lower interest rates and rising incomes support spending. The projected increase in overall GDP growth is more modest than it was in October, largely due to lower population growth that reflects new federal immigration policies. There are risks around the outlook, and Governing Council is equally concerned about inflation rising above 2% or falling below it. Absent the threat of tariffs, the risks to the inflation outlook are roughly balanced. Let me now turn to the question of tariffs. U.S. trade policy is a major source of uncertainty. There are many possible scenarios. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know what new tariffs will be imposed, when, or how long they will last. We don't know the scope of retaliatory measures or what fiscal supports will be provided. And even when we know more about what is going to happen, I do need to be clear, it's still going to be difficult to be precise about the economic impacts because we have little historical experience with tariff changes of the magnitude that the U.S. is contemplating. Nevertheless, some things are clear. A long-lasting and broad-based trade conflict would badly hurt economic activity in Canada. At the same time, the higher cost of imported goods will put direct upward pressure on inflation. The magnitude and timing of the impacts on output and inflation will depend importantly on how businesses and households in the United States and Canada adjust to higher import prices. Malheureusement, les droits de douane rendent les économies moins efficaces. Ils font baisser la production et les revenus. La politique monétaire ne peut pas contrebalancer ces effets, mais on peut aider l'économie à s'ajuster. Puisque l'inflation est revenue autour de la cible de 2 %, on est mieux placé pour être une source de stabilité économique. Mais on ne peut pas contrer une production plus basse et une inflation plus élevée en même temps, avec comme seul instrument de la politique monétaire le taux directeur. Pour déterminer notre réponse de politique monétaire, on doit bien évaluer et mettre en balance deux types de pressions sur l'inflation. Les pressions à la baisse découlant de la faiblesse de l'économie et les pressions à la hausse attribuables au prix plus élevé des entrants et aux perturbations des chaînes d'approvisionnement. Unfortunately, tariffs mean economies simply work less efficiently. We produce and earn less without tariffs. Monetary policy cannot offset this. What we can do is help the economy adjust. With inflation back around the 2% target, we are better positioned to be a source of economic stability. However, with a single instrument, our policy interest rate, we can't lean against weaker output and higher inflation at the same time. As we consider our monetary policy response, we will need to carefully assess the downward pressure on inflation from weakness in the economy and weigh that against the upward pressure on inflation from higher input prices and supply chain disruptions. So let me tell you what we're doing in preparation. In recent years, we have invested in better information on supply chains, trade links, and the connections between sectors. And this is helping us analyze the effects of supply disruptions, including tariffs. We've begun assessing the possible consequences of different tariff scenarios, and we present an example in the Monetary Policy Report. We are stepping up our outreach activities across the country to hear directly from those affected by trade uncertainty. This includes augmenting our surveys of business and consumers to better understand how trade uncertainty is affecting their decisions and how they would cope in the event of a trade conflict. We will update you on our analysis and assessments as developments unfold. Having restored low inflation and reduced interest rates substantially, monetary policy is better positioned to help the economy adjust to new developments. As always, the bank will be guided by our monetary policy framework and our commitment to maintain price stability over time. With that, the Senior Deputy Governor and I would be very pleased to take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Governor. And we will go to questions now, starting with the roughly dozen or so reporters I have here in the room in Ottawa, after which we'll go to those who have joined us remotely. As usual, I'll ask you to please limit yourself to one question so that every media outlet does get a chance to ask. And if I forget to do so, please state your name and affiliation. Please remember to use the microphone here in the room to ask your question. Et avant de poser votre question, veuillez vous identifier si je ne l'ai pas fait. Et comme toujours, libre à vous de poser vos questions, soit en anglais, soit en français. So let's start here in Ottawa. I'm going to call on Paul Vieira from the Wall Street Journal.
Governor, the decision talked about how the Canadian dollar is depreciated materially. Does this indicate that the so-called limits of policy divergence have been reached and BOC officials are worried about its potential impact on inflation? And would a weaker currency limit the Bank of Canada's ability to provide support in a trade conflict?
Okay, you packed a lot in there, Paul. And I know you know this, but I do want to begin by reminding everybody that we don't target the exchange rate. The flexible exchange rate is an integral part of our monetary policy framework that allows us to gear monetary policy in Canada to the specific situation in Canada. So if you're asking us, has the movement in the Canada-U.S. exchange rate constrained our monetary policy decisions to this point? The answer is no. We've cut our policy interest rate 6 consecutive times now, bringing the rate down from 5% to 3%, 200 basis points. That is having some impact on the Canadian dollar, but as we discuss actually at some length in the Monetary Policy Report, that effect is relatively modest. The depreciation we've seen, the recent depreciation we've seen in the Canadian dollar has been more driven, in our view, by trade uncertainty, and particularly President Trump's threats to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian exports. You can see that from a number of things, but in particular, if you look at the timing of the depreciation, it follows very closely on President Trump's threats. This is a more material move in the Canadian dollar. I mean, if you go back to October, Canadian dollar was 73, 74 cents. It's now been fluctuating. It's now sort of 69 to 70. So look, that is a material depreciation. And